Okay, started. Hi, morning everybody. We have some more people coming in a second, but I don't know if people are traveling on this weekend. It's pretty slow. Not going up. Huh? They usually run. Not this way. It's been better. Oh, it's good. Yeah. Yeah. But I started on time or tried. And I'm 2 minutes late. Um, uh, okay, so this week we are starting with our usual thing. If you just, since you're with us this week, we are talking about the spiritual practices or spiritual disciplines that we can engage in to deepen our relationship with each other and the Lord. So it's very practical based class. A lot of things that you can take, hopefully from it and immediately implement it. So a lot of it's different ideas, but also the concepts behind it. And we just finished talking about prayer, but now we're going to move on to this new practice that kind of goes with it a lot: silence and solitude. Uh, and we'll go the next week and do something unity. But each week we are starting something. We do our memory verse. Can you repeat that me? Um, if it's we do. Yeah. If it goes a lot. No, not uh, okay, so our memory verse each week, you just do it. After I noticed that if you do something just repeatedly enough, it'll stick. That usually works. I think eventually near the end, we'll start taking out words. We'll probably be able to do it still. Okay, so everyone together. Train yourself in godliness, for while physical training is of some value, godliness is valuable in every way, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come. Okay, so we are going to talk about silence and solitude today. Now, we don't usually think about these much practices. We talk about Bible study, Bible reading, memorization, talk about prayer. We've heard those sorts of things. If you grew up going to almost any church most of our lives, we've heard of those things being important. But we often don't hear about silence or solitude as being important practices for the Christian life. Now, what precedent or what examples do we have, maybe in scripture, of people going into silence or solitude, go in for periods of time?
For examples in the Bible or examples in general?
In the Bible.
I would say when Jesus went to be by himself.
Yeah, and that's repeated several times, especially in the Gospel of Mark. It's repeated several times that Jesus, he went off on the mountain to pray by himself. For a while, got away from the crowd that was constantly pressing upon him. So I feel like if the Son of God himself thought it was necessary to go off by himself and pray periods of time, it might be smart for us to do it. But then there's also other examples of the one example.
I thought Moses, that's why. Because, you had to leave Egypt, but he lived a very privileged life in Egypt.
Yes.
And then when he went out, and, he became a shepherd, which what better way to have silence and solitude? Being a shepherd, being out on the flock, watching over the night. He had a lot of time, a lot of years of solitude.
Yeah. Lots of time.
Silence and solitude.
Yes. Yeah, lots of time doing that in the wilderness of wherever you put the sheep. And then we have some other examples too, and it's even combined with other, other spiritual disciplines. But in Genesis chapter Genesis chapter 24, very long chapter about Isaac's betrothal to Rebekah. And finally, near the end of the chapter, Isaac's finally introduced it to his own betrothal episode. And around verse 63, it says, Isaac went out in the evening, walking in the field, and looking up, he saw camels coming. And then most other translations say Isaac went out to meditate in the field. At least that's what the Greek version has, and most other translations have on this side. So here, he went out into the field. It doesn't say he was alone by himself, but he went out to meditate in the field. It's one thing that happens. And then we have Saul. Whenever he's converted, he goes off into Arabia, possibly by himself, to Arabia for a couple of years. And I think that's really where sometimes he had this encounter with Jesus. And then he goes off into the wilderness of Arabia, and it seems like that period of time, a lot of that experience that he had of Christ on the road to Damascus, he had to meditate, gestate on that, and think how that completely changed his life from his very strict Pharisaical Torah observant lifestyle to now, what does life mean for him? What is it? And he admitted before taking action, he spent years in the wilderness. Who knows what he was doing entirely at that time? But I think having that retreat probably was a very important part of his formation in becoming the person that we see in the book of Acts and in his letters. He was going out and living a very active life of ministry and evangelism. Right? Okay, so we have several examples of times where people go off to pray, and it's usually a time where they're being formed in some way, where Moses goes off and he's being formed in the wilderness and sort of a lot of times in solitude. He did have a wife and eventually a kid in the wilderness, but we don't know how often his wife was out with him, with the sheep. He was alone a lot of the time. We know he was alone whenever he encountered the Lord, the angel of the Lord in the burning bush. It's not that Sinai. So it's usually a time of formation. So what is the importance of silence and solitude for us, though, in this modern day and age? Why might silence and solitude be advantageous for us as Christians?
Distractions.
Block out distractions around us.
Can't be pressured by anyone else.
You're not being pressured by a group of people or a particular person. So you're getting away from those usual pressures that you have.
I would almost argue it's getting even more valuable now because opportunities for true silence is even less than it was 20, 40, 50 years ago. Because there's always something that we got to move to this and this and this. So
You have to be very intentional about it.
yeah.
You can always be connected no matter where you are. You can get internet pretty much anywhere in the entire world now. Stars and everything. So you're pretty much always connected unless you intentionally seek out silence and solitude. Okay, what other advantages? I think these are good so far. You talk more about it. Didn't know if you had any on the top of your mind. Okay, now let's think the opposite. You might be thinking, I'm not fully convinced that it really is all that I'm looking for. Why would it be that valuable? What are some hangups you might have about going into a place where you're alone and in silence? Why might that be like, and not that enticing to you?
I feel like I should miss out on stuff with other people.
Fear of missing out is one thing.
That's right. Yeah. It's kind of selfish. So come out of one.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Are you talking about silence and solitude can feel selfish?
Not the sound of wanting to missing out part.
Yeah,
Fear is kind of selfish.
yeah, both can probably appear selfish when you look at it from that angle. Yeah, but you're right. It's fear of missing out is a really big one. We always, especially people that have a more social temperament, wanting to always be a part of something, doing something. I remember in college, I was probably going to be even more that way. There's always something to do with people all the time. And you really have to choose, what am I going to do? You can be busy every single moment of the day till, uh, even in the middle of the night, you can be busy hanging out with people if you want to. So yeah, you could have a fear of missing out. What other things might be hanging up the silence call to?
When I was in campus ministry, Stone Age, um, it was, it was looked down upon to try to get some time for yourself, that you needed to be busy, spreading the gospel, talking to everybody that knew, and trying to, get people to Bible study and all that. And so when I'm a very much an introvert, and when I would, try to get some time by myself, there was always somebody going, what were you doing? Why were you by yourself? It got to be a little stressful.
Yeah. Yeah, and so why am I going along with that? Because that's with my sermon later. Why might it be unhealthy for churches, church leaders, and just Christians in general to be like that, to push that sort of lifestyle that they seem to be pushing on you, where you're constantly have to be active, busy with people all the time? Why might that be unhealthy to do? Because everybody's different. Okay, everybody's different. I will say that there is some degree where you have to try to have some unity among people, but yeah, you do have to account for different temperaments.
If you're always thankful, you never kind of think of your actions.
Good point.
Lose focus is important.
What?
You can lose focus when it's important.
Lose focus on what's important when you're always busy, even when you're busy doing apparently good things, like they're talking about doing ministry, evangelism, whatever it is that they encourage you to do. You can still lose focus on what's important when you're busy doing those things, get lost in those things. Ministry that has to ministry all the time, all the time. Not that it's because they get so you can get inundated with so many responsibilities, and you can lose focus on really what's important and your own relationship with the Lord. So silence and solitude is very important uh, for these purposes. And can you imagine Jesus? Like Jesus, not that he necessarily was mind God's work this way, because he always did what he saw the Father do. He always was obeying God's will in that respect. But think Jesus could have been thinking, I can't. I don't have time to retreat. I could heal 1,000 more people if I didn't go up on this mountain right now. He could have been thinking I could always do more. He didn't heal every single person in the entire world whenever he came here that had a physical illness. Um, so that's
But that is the danger, feeling like you're not being productive.
yeah, feeling like you're not being productive. And this is something I've had to think a lot about the past year and a half, 2 years, thinking about the Christian life and sort of the busyness aspect of it. And I think there's a sort of tension in the Bible where, it's like we'll work till Jesus comes, and, with the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. We're supposed to be working while it is day. That sort of mentality, working, you're told that a lot, but I feel like it's much less emphasized about the rest aspect by church leaders. And there's definitely a balance that we have to try to think about and wrestle with ourselves.
There's multiple times, multiple examples, and I'm sure you've already covered it or you're going to, that Jesus went away to be alone. with God and to meditate and to pray. And he, even though he was doing all the healing, all the evangelism, the Sermon on the Mountain, trying to seek and save the lost, he was doing all those things, constantly working. But he thought it was important to go and be alone with God. Pray.
Yeah,
And we're supposed to follow his example.
that's right.
And it's not easy, but I'm just saying, we need to do both.
Yeah, and, yes, great.
I was thinking of two things, I haven't saying out of the hands of the devil's workshop. So, by yourself, maybe you feel like you're by yourself, you be tempted to, do things you shouldn't do. The other thing is family responsibility. You know, there could be a family emergency if you're all by yourself and you have your cell phone turned off. Could be an emergency that you're supposed to attend to.
You're right.
Big deal.
Right. Yeah, that can feel about, we'll talk more about that. I'm not saying that there has to be one single rule for every single person.
Right.
All the time in terms of this, if a person who's single or a person who's retired and kids are out of the house, it's in a very different place than someone who has 3 kids still in the house, right? So you have different expectations possibly for different phases in life, but it's still something that maybe we should try to seek out. It's just an hour at a time.
And when you're retired, all your kids see you as an available babysitter. So you go back to having kids, except when they have to have a doctor change. Yeah. That's why else to
Right. Oh yeah, I know. I believe you. Once you're retired, I know that a different type of work starts.
But it does carry, I know this doesn't apply to everyone, but it does carry over because when you retire, when you were working, you felt like you had to be really productive you didn't sit around and work, for an hour a day contemplating life. So in retirement, you feel like you've got to be productive, and if you're not, you feel guilty, and it's so different. It's a shit.
The one I asked, said you did.
Contemplate life.
Contemplate life, and then you were saying you feel guilty, I know so.
Well,
I mean, you feel guilty, and I think one of the advantages is silence, especially having somewhere. That middle point, silence can keep us from constantly justifying ourselves and solitude in general. It's sometimes we view ourselves and our self-worth in terms of how much we can produce, especially men as men. It's something I try to think about a ton with myself. Our culture tells us this essentially, and even certain passages of scripture feel like they might even tell us this stuff. If you just try to take maybe the parable of the talents, you bring my mysteries out of thinking my only worth is how much good works I can produce. If you think about it just sort of in isolation in the rest of scripture. But we can feel the need to constantly justify our time and saying, am I being productive in some way at this time? And part of that is, but God, he said in his covenant with the Israelites a time of rest where they weren't supposed to be productive. It wasn't a time it was just a time where they're supposed to rest. It doesn't even say what they're supposed to do just to rest. They're not supposed to work on that day.
I know one thing about solitude that may keep people from doing it. And sometimes when God may ask, talk to you.
Yeah, I mean,
He may, all right. He may start pointing out the things you may not want to hear.
yeah, that's right. And with it, there's lots of discomfort that comes with it, but also discomfort that comes with boredom that's really the thing I think most of us love fear, especially my age and younger, whenever you grew up around the constant stimulation of television and devices that you carry around with you all the time. You don't, coping with boredom can be much more difficult for younger people especially. And yet it's probably very important for them especially to learn how to do that. Really young age. And, oh,
I'm sorry, so I'm looking at your list up here, and I'm struggling a little bit with it. Silence elements. It's keep us from speaking foolish. How's that? I didn't look at James, I'll look at James.
yeah, okay, so go over there. That's
That's
good.
the quote. Better keep your mouth shut, open can move all out.
Oh.
If you don't have something nice to say, don't say it at all. So another proverb that you might have heard it really good. But the oops, yeah, in James 1 or 2, 3, 12, it talks a lot about the dangers of the tongue. And I probably don't have a specific one, but I can tell you from my own experience. And probably there's also other proverbs about remaining silent sometimes. And fools feel the need to talk all the time. I think I can, if someone wants to look up more of those, I don't have it readily available.
Yeah, I got you now. I thought you really, I was looking at silence as being an intentional time of silence, not being like, if we were all silent in class.
Well, even remaining silent, even in the midst of crowds, and we're going to talk about this. Solitude in silence, you can retreat into sort of in solitude at times, even in the middle of a crowd, if that's what you need. Obviously, it's not ideal, but there's times when you can have this sort of a time where you retreat inward, and that's not. I'm not saying that this is something you should do all the time. But you should remain silent and solitude forever. There's times where we're supposed to be together in community, engaged with one another, listening. But there's times when you do need to.
And some of us have a really hard time with the things with silence. And there's a silence, and you want to fill in the gap. You want to fill that silence in. And that's hard, but oftentimes it's good just to sit back and be silent, listen, not feel the need to fill in the space.
Could be filling in the gap or something foolish just because.
You're more than likely will be because your purpose is to fill in the silence, not to actually contribute.
Yeah, and that's right. And our it can lead our minds into uncomfortable places. So you want to distract from that with the noise of some sort, or some sort of other thing to take your mind off of your own thoughts and your patterns, or your mind out maybe other beneficial things. But often wrestling with those things that we try to suppress and praying about to God is very important. Uh, there might be all sorts of things we're trying to distract ourselves from. And that's one thing people use work and other things as a way to distract from other parts of their lives they don't want to confront. And those are the things that we need to be praying about more if we're aware of them instead of just hiding from them and hoping that they don't come up. I think we need to be more prayerful and meditate on those things instead of running away from. I know that there might be certain anxieties, there might be certain fears that you have, things in your past. I'm not saying that we always need to be thinking about negative things when we're in silence either. But sometimes the greatest healing happens in silence. Whenever you pray to God in silence at that time. And so silence is a premium. So are there any ways I can go through this? We keep just constantly justifying ourselves and our time to others. That's one that I think we can want it in a digital way. If I was preaching especially or teaching the class, 30s and 20s and teens, you could want to speak out online, speak out in your videos, to justify yourself, to argue with people, to state this is my position on this right here, and this is why. We see that all the time, and sometimes there's a lot of times where that's not necessary, and you don't need to justify yourself. God will justify. And I know this is one I'm teaching myself too. I need to think about times when I speak to constantly try to explain myself why I'm doing what I'm doing. Because I can be anxious about that. I can be anxious about how I'm justifying myself, always wanting to do that, where I'm not just at peace, at rest, letting hopefully those things, God settle those, a lot of those things for me. We're trusting God inside. Um, yeah, and I guess sorry, last thing before I'm going. Silence can, I'm not saying that people who are already very silent and like to retreat into that, maybe this lesson isn't as much for you as it is for others. There's another spiritual discipline of being in community, being interactive with others in your church family, especially, and in the community at large, and trying to be a good listener and trying to be uh, of service to those people and attentive to those people. So that's a whole other spiritual discipline that we're going to talk about that maybe is more for those people who are like to retreat, get away, and maybe have a fear of people. And so it can be an active break for you, but also something that you can grow in, that the Lord will help you. So that first point is kind of what Rob said. It allows you to listen to God more closely. And often you can hear God more clearly in the silence, especially as you're reading scripture. It might not come, God might not speak to you in a sort of audible voice. But there's a lot of times where great revelations will come to you. And I'm not someone who says that there's nothing supernatural that ever happens. So God can reveal things to us about our lives, about our sin, especially if we're praying about those things, and maybe give us a clear path forward. And so that's why silence and prayer and even fasting can go together oftentimes. And often feasting and community can go together too. Jesus often, if he's not retreating into the mountains, he's eating with people at their tables and in their homes. And I think, as you said, Daniel, one of the things that happens when you're constantly around crowds, you're listening to other people, being influenced by other people. And so it's crucial when making important decisions to, you should listen to important voices. You should get input from very wise people that you respect. But sometimes it's good to just be alone with God, even with your own self too. Not have all those different voices competing in your head. Really helps get you some clarity at that point. And it helps you learn to go with boredom, where that law of life should be. Is something that a lot of people struggle with today. And boredom is honestly just a part of life. It's something, it's part of God can work in us in the boredom even when we can't perceive it. Okay, let's see. Yeah, we already talked about that first point. Whenever asked, what is solitude for? It can remove distractions and help you focus on God and even God's activity in your life. It helps lead to meditation, that lead to these other disciplines that we might have talked about, spoken about already. It can also, has there ever been a time where you had a lot of downtime, alone time? Maybe you were sitting, maybe traffic, you'll be more listening, more invested in listening to music. That's what I would do probably, to podcasts or something. But has there ever been a time where you're kind of forced to be silent at all, like just forced to be bored? Do you remember a time like that?
Can you attention to the
I'm sure the military is often,
Can't be right.
yes.
If you have somewhere where there's a blizzard or hurricane, whatever, you have a power outage, where you don't have all the noises and TV distractions, where you force to be in silence.
Yeah. Yeah, the lockdown in 2020, especially the lockdowns, that was definitely a time where it was so weird, and a time where, wow, there's nothing going on really at all outside right now. Everyone's just sort of chilling. And it's kind of, there was a certain beauty to it. I know it was a lot of chaos going on at that time, but there was a certain beauty to the whole country sort of being at rest, and forced to rest, take a breather. And I think that's really what led to some political unrest. People had part of it, people were watching the news constantly. That's probably a bad thing. They weren't really in silence there. But people were reflecting on more of listening to, thinking about the injustices and everything that they were perceiving and being told about. It led to a lot of crazy attacks in 2020. But anyway, and I remember that time being a time of more reflection and healing. I mean, that was getting to be a big pivotal point in my life where I was transitioning to move to an entirely different state and everything as well. So, there's a lot of good things. But anyone else have a time when you were forced to be quiet or silent or in solitude?
I did this before, but again, when I was on the ship and patrolling in the Caribbean, late at night on the fantail, looking up at the stars, nobody else around me, no land around us, just alone by myself. Even though there's a whole ship full of people, I was the only one on the fantail. So I wasn't forced to do it. I just wanted to do it. I wanted to be alone with God.
Yeah, I'm sure you're constantly surrounded by
And that's probably more the reason why I did it, is because there's hundreds of other guys in close quarters. I just wanted to be away
I'm sure
from periods of
do.
time.
Your boots. Yeah. Yeah. But so what? How can you like? What was the advantage of that for you? Like, what is? Did you? Looking back now, obviously maybe not in the moments you don't really feel anything that happens that you can see, but well,
It made it easier to go back and be a part of the chaos afterwards, like a recharge. I didn't learn that then, but now with Kim being introverted and knowing, and like after church, she has to go be by herself and recharge. And that's kind of what I felt when I was on the ship, even though I'm not introverted. I needed to be somewhere quiet, away from the chaos.
it can be a time of recharging and rejuvenation. And one thing that's interesting about this is that like let's talk about silent solitude. It's not just in modern books. Like whenever I read ancient literature that's written, a lot of people that wrote talk about the importance of getting away from the crowds. And that was before they had social media and all that. But they like getting away from all the hustle and bustle of the city and getting out and being able to have times have to get out and think, to contemplate, to look at the beauty around you, and to engage your mind with more helpful things instead of all the business of everyday life. I read several passages with people in even Jesus' time earlier that talked about the value of that. And so it's not just something that is a modern thing that we need to do, but something that people have been practicing for a very long time, as we talked about even in scripture. It's needed.
Isn't that that's a cornerstone of monastic life, right?
Certain monastic groups. So there's two different types of monasticism. We don't get into this, but there's anchorite monasticism, which is very much you're all alone in your cell, or some people out in the middle of the desert by themselves. And then there's more kenopitic, which is the word, but just think about living together in a monastery together, where it's more communal. They're together all the time, but they might have times where they're by themselves in prayer too. So yeah, there's different types, but yeah, either way, you want to. There's at least some periods of silence for almost all monks in the ancient world and modern world.
With a skull, a candle, and a piece of scripture.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been doing some more study on them because some of them can be, those writings can be very extreme. I don't know about the wisdom, but I try to always, when reading people I disagree with, I try to look at it as much from their perspective as possible, if there's any value in it, where I completely discount it. So that's still to be determined on some of. There's this one ancient ascetic monk in, I don't know, probably like in the 300s AD. And his name was Simon, and he sat up on a pillar in the desert for years at a time. Yeah, but he's like the most unhealthy and crazy. Most people look at him. He went to like maybe the farthest extreme of sitting out on the top of a pillar in the middle of nowhere for years. Um, and people are like, well, what use is he? And part of what monks realize is that it's not necessarily about the modern idea of I always have to make every second of my day useful or nothing. They realized that there was value in just intimacy with God and certain things. And then they sort of have that, and they realize that they're not everyone's called to that life. But anyway, I was like digression. Usually that's the word. Anyway, I don't get to talk about that very much, so again, I felt I need to. It's not looking at yet. Oh. What?
What was the last thing you said? He died of what?
I don't know. We have to do it. I don't know if I don't know who was saying that. But you did die.
You said something about you making a summary about what ended up with what probably ended.
That pillar, is that what it was?
Simon's Diletes is what he's called if you want to look him up. Styletes, the stylite. He just means someone who sat on it. That's the word for pillar in Greek. So that's why they called him that. Sat up pillar in the middle of a desert for years. And he was, if you read about him, he's like not. I don't think he was the most spiritually transformed person. There are some monks you read their writings. They definitely have some rough edges to them.
They get lost in their head.
Yeah, and they, yeah. Not just lost in their head, but lost. They can get lost.
I was thinking about all the Castaway with Tom Hanks, he's got all the silence he can stand, he's gotta start talking to a softball. They ain't doing everything. He had a good name for Wilson.
That's
Right
right.
on it, so.
There we go.
But, it is interesting, I mean, there's all these extremes, like the guy on the pillar, people that don't ever talk, people that talk all the time. I know when I'm riding to my mom's 5 hours away, I'll listen to podcasts for about 3 hours. I like that stimulation of learning. But after about 3 hours, I cut that thing off and start thinking. I think we all have to find our balance. Anything in life, take it to the extreme. I always wondered about these monasteries where people, what are they doing? Mankind. I know there's some probably doing something. You gotta be doing something, right?
Like the dude on the pillar, how does he need that?
Well, if they're engaging in constant prayer for mankind, that is doing something that most people do not in church. Right. So that is something, but that again gets into our tension of, how much do we just try to value how much, we think the person who does the most things for humankind is, or in the world is the most valued and.
Or they define the earn their grace.
Or if they think that that's where their value derives from, even if they're not trying to earn grace, they think that shows that they are a worthy servant in a certain degree. And I mean, there's some validity to it, but it's all taken to the extreme. And I know that could have thought about that, probably had that sort of mentality in my life before. It's probably still struggle with it. So it's something, but it's kind of nice to talk about this because goes well with what we're going to talk about in the next hour lesson. But and let's talk about retreat before we class. So I encourage people to go on. You can have times of silence each day, right? Or time of silence each week. Maybe you can't do it every day, but if you want to do something weekly, maybe you have a couple hours on Saturday morning. You wake up early and you just sit in silence, or you just sit outside and you just hear wind and the birds outside. I remember doing that last week. I woke up on one of my days off and just went outside, meditated and journaled for a bit, and I was like, and it was just a peaceful time, especially with how chaotic my life has been with me adjusting to constantly. It was just nice to sit there and breathe and be for a bit. Realize it's the world around me. These birds don't care about what I do or my life whatsoever. They, I can just sit there and they're just going about doing their business, getting their morning breakfast. So it's kind of nice to get you out of the middle of your the craziness and just really lets you breathe sometimes. But then there's other times where you might have a longer time by yourself. To retreat. I know some people take instead of maybe going on vacation all the time, going somewhere super stimulating and crazy, they take a weekend off to go off and be by themselves, recharge, and they try to. And there's definitely better and worse ways to go about that. Ways where you get the most benefit, like not getting on your phone or your email at the time, things like that. I'm trying. One thing I'm trying to do. And I don't know if this will be a time where we Solitude. So I'll invite any other guy who wants to come with me. But next month, I get for Father's Day. Let's say this for Father's Day and Mother's Day. Rachel and I always give the other person a complete day off to do whatever they want. Take care of. So that's what we're doing with that time. And so what I decided, like, just give me a night off. I want to go drive down Harper's Point. Harper's Island. And then there's a dark sky, international dark sky. You see the Milky Way and everything on a clear night. And I kind of just want to go there, just start for a night. That's what I'm going to do in July. Any men would come. If not, then I'll use that as my stalking time. Do that.
Dark sky.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that everything geese all the time?
Huh?
Isn't that everything geese all the time? It's not me, can't look at it. It's actually- I've been there at night and it's incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe I misspoke. I think it is Harvard. I had it written down somewhere. But just getting out and doing it out in nature, going camping. Some people do that. It can be a time where you feel more less. You get away from that hustle and bustle and more connected to creation, to God. So I encourage that sort of mentality where you don't have to necessarily be productive every second of the day, as we're often taught. You can just let God try to produce something in you in silence. And you might not feel it immediately, and you might get bored, and you might feel lots of discomfort. These are all things to expect, and I know that doesn't. In a class, I'm trying to encourage you to do these things. might be like, why are you telling us about that? But I want you to just be forewarned that there is some discomfort probably involved, and you might not sense immediate feedback, as with all these things like reading scripture, prayer, this. And not everything's going to give you an immediate benefit, and that's one of the hard parts about it. Just like exercise, some helps. Usually, the first few times exercise is extremely uncomfortable. Even the first few weeks exercising, depending, you can feel horrible. No feelings of benefit whatsoever. You know, you didn't meet your goals by doing that. You just feel weak, you feel tired. But if you stick with it, usually you're going to see results. And I'm using that comparison. But a lot of these things, God, it's a means of encountering God, being with God. So I think it's always worth it doing it. Even if there's nothing that we can show to others. We don't have to justify ourselves. Okay. Any last comments or questions? Any pushback you want to give? I like that. Okay. Well, we're going to end actually sort of on time today, and like where I teach over the way. So, all right, we're going to the prayer with screen.
So, Sylvia and I ask for continued prayers for Lucian